Hi, everyone. Welcome to Satsang this wonderful Sunday. And today we're going to talk about the mind. It's chapter 7. And this is actually it's interesting. We've worked with some deep waters, so to speak, so far. But this one is the one. When you look at it, there's some real kind of interesting territory that we cover, and so we'll talk about that today. The questioner in this one, I really quite like, and I'm going to read the very first question because um, it's a fascinating little piece when you read it. So here's how it starts. He goes, "There are very interesting books written by apparently very competent people in which the illusoriness of the world is denied, although not its transitoriness. According to them, there exists a hierarchy of beings from lowest to highest. On each level, the complexity of the organism enables and reflects the depth, breadth, and intensity of consciousness without any visible or knowable culmination. One law supreme rules throughout: evolution of forms for the growth and enrichment of consciousness and manifestation of its infinite potentialities." Now, I challenge you all to read that paragraph 5 or 6 times, and you will probably come to the same conclusion that I did, that it's in the category somewhere between uh, conspiracy theory and modern New Age. It lives right in that kind of world, as you read it. And so I definitely would have expected the answer. Because as I was actually speaking a little earlier, the intellectual approach really does include the loosening, unwinding, dissolving of intellect, so the mind itself, in order for something else to emerge. And actually, it's the movement of identity, and Nisargatta talks about that. But you could not have come up with a better setup for this conversation than this particular paragraph, because this is about as mind locked as you're going to find. It really is. I'm not entirely sure what it means. As I said, the first time I read it, I went, "Oh, I wonder how to explain that." And then I read it a couple more times, and I go, "You can't explain that. It's just not possible, you know." So of course, Nisargadatta immediately comes back, and here's what he says. He says, "This may or not be so. This may or may not be so." Fair enough. So your description of whatever this is, um, sure, it could not be. He said, even if it is only so from the mind's point of view. So the first thing he does is he establishes where all of that lives, right? And you can see that where that lives can generate and foment endless conversation, because that paragraph could do that. He says, but the entire universe, he said, in fact, the entire universe exists only in consciousness. Now follow him, because he's going to work back and forth between consciousness and the absolute for this entire little piece here. And so you have to watch him go back and forth. He says, while I have my stand in the absolute, right? And then he does something that's really interesting. He equates the absolute to pure being. He goes, in pure being, that's the next sentence, consciousness arises. Right. So this is a little bit of a different take. You hear people talk about the absolute, but it usually doesn't have a sense to it, such as pure being. So that I just want you to note that he grounds this in that little piece, and then he'll play back and forth. In consciousness, the world appears and disappears. So within that pure being, within consciousness, arises a beginning and an ending of consciousness. It appears, right? It begins, it appears, and it disappears. He said, um, all there is me, and all there is mine. Before all beginnings and after all endings, I am, right? So what's interesting here is that it's clear that when we talk about the absolute and pure being, and then the I am, right? And then from I am, we basically build the arising of consciousness itself from that I am. So the I am kind of has this really, in my mind, difficult to nail down, like nailing Jello to the wall. I think it's intellectually repellent in a certain way, because it's very difficult to talk about pure being and the I am, because typically you would talk about the I am as being, if you will, embedded in the absolute. Here he connects them up, right? So where's the only place that that's going to sort itself out? It's going to sort itself out in being itself, right? That's where the sorting out is. It's at the point in time where there is no uh, mind or interpretive facilities that are working with that. Mike, I have a hand raised. Michael, you want to
Yeah,
interject
I
here?
just you said the I am was embedded in the absolute. Could you
Yeah,
just talk a little bit more about that?
sure.
Because I get what you're saying around being, like pure being sort of the
Yep,
first contraction away from the absolute, if you will, or the
yep,
first contraction into manifestation.
yep.
But how is that not the kind of final I am, if you will, that pure
Well,
beingness before? Because the absolute for me is kind of like the unknown. There is no I am kind of associated with it.
yeah, and I'm okay with that nomenclature, or I'm actually okay when you said the pure I am, right,
Hmm.
and equating that with the absolute itself. I think at a certain point
Hmm.
in in the movement and in the arising of who we are, and in that discovery, what happens is you have to point back to it, right? So these nomenclatures end up being built in order for that pointing. And the one thing you'll see he's going to get into is when he starts to talk about how things are defined and boundaried, and all of those things, of course, live in the world of the mind. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to take this mind piece and you're trying to point back to something that is simply a one piece action, right? I don't, um, I mean, the first thing I think one has to encounter is that, in awakening, how can awakening the ineffable be in essence described, right? Well, of course, we all agree the ineffable can't be described, right? So then we say, well, let's create a pointer. Well, that seems almost as stupidly silly to me as the first one, but nonetheless, we buy in and say, what the hell will do that? Because it's a little like, I always tell that story about how the West are all the people sitting around the pool, and what they're doing is they're talking about water, right? And a master walks in and he puts his foot on your back and he pushes you in, and now you know what water is, right? That you don't there, you're in the water. So being in the water is the experience of being in the water, and sitting on the side and talking about it with your friends is a different thing. And the West is addicted to the discussing of, or the description of, as you will. So to me, when you get into that place, I think there's a place where you say, um, be in the water. In other words, what's the when and in fact, I think this it's not a bad thing to look at this as a possible um, getting off the hook of an addictive style of thinking, which is that whatever happens has to be described and explained.
Hmm.
Right? That those two things live so much together. So I think in this, like I say, I think a deep part of this is him actually pointing away from that welded union that we all live within our own conditioning.
Mm.
So that's how I would go after that. So I know that wasn't an answer to your question because I'm kind of saying I don't think at one point in time there isn't an answer to the question.
Yeah, no, I get it. I
Yeah.
think it's just like I have sort of I guess I just personally have an allergy to the I am thing because I think it's confusing because like an I am can be a personal egoic story. You know, it can be the experience of the witness where the I amness feels, you know, like the observer that's looking at something. And then the I am can be pure beingness. And then if you associate it with the absolute in any way, then it just really becomes a, you know, kind of
Yeah.
becomes a mess because it can describe at pretty much any level that you go to.
And I agree with that. In fact, you'll notice I'm a little more, what's the word? I'm a little more define things mentally. You get into some of the details in ways I don't, but
Yep.
you'll notice that and when I speak, I have a habit just because of exactly that reason. Like pure being to me, okay, I can go there, right? But the minute that I introduce the I am, that to me is, the absolute pure being, absolute love, pure love, all of those which describe the state of the absolute and the ineffable, right? The way the known lives within the unknown. So you get the known and the unknown, right? So just to make it simple for how it is, I like to go after it. I have a habit of dividing those things up when I speak, just because and I think it keeps it clear from a speaking standpoint.
Mm.
But the actual awakening itself, there are no markers on the road there.
Right.
And that's how that works. Do you have a comment, Tanner? I saw a hand raised for a minute there.
Well, quite a number of times in the book, he says that the I am is just sort of, I mean, I'm not using his terms, but it feels to me like he's describing it almost as a gateway that needs to be destroyed at some point to get to the absolute. So, the way that I read the way that he's speaking to most of the questioners is he's really just sort of, it feels to me that he's just poking at their ego, and so the language is constantly changing. Like you can't really look at it like a math equation where this equals that, because each one feels like it's just trying to break through, like crack through the mind. I mean, that's how
Right.
I read it anyway.
Right. Right, because I think what happens is, we talk about it, how it arises and it falls, right? So I think here's where that kind of movement back and forth gets a little confusing, because in pure being would be that within which something rises and falls, begins or ends. And yet we talk a lot about the I am, which needs to dissolve or disappear, right? So when you're talking about that, you're talking about something that clearly is, although it's the foundation of consciousness, it still is consciousness. So it rises and falls and begins and ends. So pure being and the I am, you can see that those two, when you speak of them, clearly live in differentiated places, so to speak, right? And yet he does clearly cross back and forth with that. So and I think you're right. I think in a certain way, I kind of like that, because if you think about the ego, the um, the ego will work really, really hard to do all of that categorization, right? So this clearly is poking at the ego if you look at it from that particular standpoint. Here's the other thing is, although the um, translator for I am that was an incredibly developed intellect. He was a translator. So now you're getting into the leaning of a translator is to put structure and elegance in whatever it is that's translated. That it's predetermined in the function that a translator is asked to execute. So that is an entirely mind game, if you will. That's what translation ends up being. So the best you're going to get is a version from a translator of what it was that Nisargadatta said. And so that's at play in here as well. But I like that because the awakening, the awakening moment, clearly, as I said, there are no delineations within that moment, right? So it's a revealing, if you will. But of what, it's indescribable. So as long as that becomes the ultimate pointer, if that's in there somewhere, then the rest of these, definitional pieces can be looked at and go, okay, if I wanted to teach it, how would I teach it so that movement could occur? That's the only thing that ends up mattering. You kick somebody in the pool, did they go in the pool? Right? That's that ultimately. And so then when somebody comes back and says, well, were you thinking da 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 da, you know, what I was thinking was the pool is right there. And so remember that, like I say, let clarity happen within all of this, and then understand that there is no clarity within all of this. You're just doing that as as a crutch, if you will, to get, to go from constructed thought to not unconstructed, non-constructed awakening, right? That bridge, and that bridge, I don't think is capturable, as it were. Yeah. So it's really interesting. So let's go on with this. Anybody else? No. Okay. Um, so this fellow goes on to say, he says, why do you deny being to the world? Right. And he says, oh, I don't negate the world. I'm not doing that. He says, I just see it appearing in consciousness, which is the totality of the known in the immensity of the unknown. Right. So that gets into Michael's kind of known and unknown. Right. So you're back to, absolute source, and unknown kind of gets to be in that category. Right. So what begins and ends is mere appearance. The world can be said to appear, but not to be. So remember, got to go back to pure being in order to make that make sense, right? It's the only way it makes sense. Otherwise it won't. So that's that stretch of the definition. He said the appearance may last very long, or on some scale of time, be very short on another, but ultimately it comes to the same. Whatever is time bound is momentary, and it has no reality. Now, I know that this is a very beginning thing, but I really want to point out here that you need to understand that in the speaking, the difference in the speaking of what reality is to Nisargadatta and a teaching like this, and what reality is to the Western mind, right? In the Western mind, you would say something like, that has reality, right? Tangibility. It's real, right? That's real. In the teaching, nothing that begins and ends, arises and falls, could be called real. Real definitionally is that which always has been, is, and always will be. Right?
See, this
That's
is where I was thinking, I'm sorry for
go for
interrupting,
it. No, please.
but this is where I was thinking as you were discussing the last point was as I was going on my journey, I kept thinking, okay, this is Advaita, this is not two, this is non-duality. What do I know for sure that does not have an opposite? What do I know for sure? Like, for instance, the thought of control. Well, then there's out of control. If control was real, then I would have the control to never be out of control. And that's not in this that we're
No,
experiencing. That doesn't happen.
no.
So as I was pondering it, it was like the only thing that I know absolutely, for sure, that has never changed in this now almost 72 years is my existence.
Okay.
That's it. There's nothing else. And so, what is that existence? That's, you know, um,
So
there's,
Nisargadatta is famous. You almost have said the whole quote, which is one of my favorites, which is all that is known is that existence is. The rest is interpretation.
yeah,
So that's the mind, right? Interpretation is the mind.
right.
So, so the rest of it is interpretation, right? And he even talks about, well, if you propose, and it's in here, if you propose a non-existence, well, you know, the existence that I am, which is known, immediately refutes that, right? Because there is no duality to that particular piece, right? That at least that we know. I have yet to meet someone who will declare to me that they don't exist. I haven't had that one happen yet. However, I am from California and it could happen. I want you to know, but so far so good. There's probably somebody up there on Hollywood Boulevard that can tell me why they don't exist, but so far so good. Yeah. So you're dead on. You're dead on. So just that's the grounding of the whole thing. So when you start to hear about what's real and what's not real, it's so embedded in us, right? That, like I say, anything, I mean, even feelings, anything that can be basically identified by perception, right? That becomes in our world, that's something that we would call real, right?
And my quantum physics teaching tells me that that object that you just had in your hand is really nothing but space.
That's correct.
There is no solidity anywhere.
That's correct.
It's
So,
space and
and include
vibration
and
and,
the knuckles knocking on it, space, right? So objects end up in quantum being not objects, but basically fields of empty space, as it were, right?
and energy
Yeah,
of vibration of whatever. Who knows? I don't know.
yeah, yeah. And 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 of course the perception part, you get back to the you know uh, basically that the absolute, right, outside of consciousness, because when there's consciousness, it arises. So basically you have the perceived and the perceiver that arise together within conscious, that happens. But outside of that, right, so you would have absolute awareness unaware of itself, right? There would be no built-in perceptive thing happening there, right? So that's the that when you drill down, that's where you end up. Now, is there an experience of that? Again, there are no markings on the highway here when you start to speak in those kinds of terms.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely. So anyway, we'll just continue on. He says, surely you see the actual world as it surrounds it. You seem to behave quite normally, right? And he says, well, that's how it appears to you. He says, what in your case occupies the entire field of consciousness is a mere speck in mind. Now, remember, we talk about the mind and consciousness being the obstruction to seeing all that, all that the absolute source and all the rest of it. That's because consciousness is identified as being who we are. So that obstructs the viewing. It's like the painting on a canvas, and we don't see the canvas, we see the painting. Right. So that's what he's after here. And then, but when when consciousness dissolves, right, and the witnessing begins, then another spot in the field is now occupied, and that's what he's after. So that's what he says. He says, I it's a speck in mine. What in your case occupies the entire field of consciousness is a mere speck in mine. Now, there's only one way that could be the case, and that is if that speck somehow or another were being perceived from, right, the witness space, right? The witnessing is the reduction of the entire field of consciousness into a speck. That's what it, that's what it does. So he goes on for the rest of this time to play back and forth between the two worlds. And of course, mind is what he is labeling, if you will, the world of consciousness itself, right? He says, and he says, the world lasts but for a moment. It's your memory that makes you think that the world continues. Myself, I don't live by memory. I see the world as it is, a momentary appearance in consciousness. So you see, he goes back and forth. He says, in your consciousness. Now, of course, he jumps right on that. He goes, all idea of me, mine, and even of I am is in consciousness. So here we're back into the conversation that Michael and I were having earlier. He said, is then your absolute being unconsciousness? He goes, no, sorry. He said, the idea of unconsciousness exists in consciousness only. So that's the idea of non-existence exists where? In consciousness, right? You exist. The idea of non-existence would have to be within this bubble of mind and consciousness, right? Then how do you know? Now this is really, really important now, because you're going to love this one. Then how do you know that you are in the supreme state? And the answer is, because I am in it, it is the only natural state. Right. So I always remember, I think it was Longfellow, the famous English poet, who's talking to a child, and he says, why is the grass green? And the child looks at him as though he's the stupidest human on earth and says, it's green because it's green. So think about that for a minute. How do you know that you are in the supreme state? Well, that's basically a causal statement asking for knowledge, right? And so he says there's only one answer to that, because I am in it. It is the only natural state. So I think the conclusion that one has to arrive at, I don't think you can arrive at any other conclusion, is that in essence, trying to claim that someone is or isn't, quote unquote, within a state, right, is an entire waste of time, right? There's just, I don't think there's a getting to that particular piece, right? So what piece is there a getting to, right? If you get pushed into the water, you're wet, right? For someone to then ask you or give you a quiz about the wetness is an entire waste of time, because wetness really isn't for a response to a quiz, not its function, right? So we have a hard time with that, because we like to build, test, drop into causality everything that we see. That's what we do. That's the Western perception. And he goes, of course, what's the question that he asks? Can you describe it? Right, first question out the gate. Now it's interesting. Here's where he starts to play between the two places. He says, only by negation. He says, as uncaused, think of these worlds, right? Uncaused, independent, unrelated, undivided, uncomposed, unshakable, unquestionable, unreachable by effort. Okay, so only by negation. Every positive definition is from memory and therefore inapplicable. And yet my state is supremely actual and therefore possible, realizable, and attainable. Right. But what he's described in here is the ineffable. He's basically done a description of something that can't be described. Right. He's pointed to that for sure. So that's where that is. So the questioner goes on to say, are you not immersed timelessly in an abstraction? Right. So this is kind of like the sour grapes, right? If I can't get there, I'll put it in a category that basically I'll turn it into a eunuch, and then for sure we got it covered, right? So he says abstraction is mental and verbal, disappears in sleep or swoon, reappears in time. I am in my own state, timelessly in the now, past and future in the mind only. I am now. All you can say. He goes, the question of the world too is now. He goes, which world? Okay, the world around us. So he goes on, he says, it is your world you have in mind, not mine. He says, what do you know of me, or even my talk with you is in your world only. You have no reason to believe that my world is identical with yours. Okay, so watch out for, I always talk about that, watch out for universalization, right? The idea that there is some universal thing to be spoken of, right? Even the ineffable, it's very difficult to claim that that's universal in some way. So now that's a conversation that I'm sure I'll be challenged on, but I'll stick with that for now. So he says, my world is real, true, as it is perceived, while yours, he's going to tell him it lives in interpretation, right? It appears and disappears according to the state of the state of your mind. Your world is something alien and you're afraid of it. My world is myself and I am at home. Now he goes on to talk about what his world is, right? He said, he goes on, he said, let me just read through the whole thing. He says, if you are the world, how can you be conscious of it? Is not the subject of consciousness different from its object? And what does he say? Consciousness and the world appear and disappear together. Hence, they are two aspects of the same state, right? The observer and the observed, they come together. He said, in sleep, I am not. The world continues. That's the questioner. Nisargatta, how do you know? On waking up, I come to know. My memory tells me. Memory is in the mind. The mind continues in sleep. It is partly in abeyance. Yeah, but its world picture is not affected. As long as the mind is there, your body and your world are there. Your world is mind-made, subjective, enclosed within the mind, fragmentary, temporary, personal, hanging on the thread of the moment. Right? That's that world. Right? The world of the mind, the world of consciousness. He said, so is yours. And he goes, no. I live in a world of realities while yours is of imaginings. Now, I want you to know you're gonna have to go long and hard and far to find most masters aren't so frontal in a conversation like this, right? I mean, are you awakened? And you'll watch most folks that that awakening has occurred to have a tendency not to like to talk about that because it's confusing. It really is. It's a very confusing thing to talk about because there's always the attachment of awakening to the body mind in the conversation. And a teacher wants to do everything they can not to have that in the conversation. So that's why you see most masters and awakened ones, they don't like to speak about that.
Because it's concepts.
Right. So here you have a Big Mac truck who's going, no, I mean, this is about as frontally claimed as anything I've ever read. I mean, he's just, yeah, oh no, this is my world, right? So nobody's dancing around. He's not worried about if you personalize it. If you personalize it, don't let me get in the way. Here's what's going on. So very different. I mean, this is a very different thing. And I can tell you, you can go through all of the kind of the teachers, and I mean, there's some that are just so soft, right? That I think this question might, completely collapse the world that they like to speak from. So So just note that this is a really kind of a very courageous way of teaching, for sure. He says, your world is personal, private, unshareable, intimately your own. No one can enter it. See as you see, hear as you hear, feel your emotions, think your thoughts. He said, in your world, you are truly alone, enclosed in an ever-changing dream, which you take for life. My world is an open world, common to all, accessible to all. In my world, there is community, insight, love, real quality. The individual is the total, the totality in the individual. All are one, and one is all. He says, is your world full of things and people as is mine? And he goes, no, it's full of myself. Right? He says, but do you see and hear as we do? Now, here's the real key to something that might occur as you're moving with this kind of material. One of the things Ramesh would talk about often was what we call free samples, which always makes me laugh because only a businessman would label this as a free sample, right? It's like it got into the lexicon, but that's the moment of the dropping of everything and the experience of awakening. Now, those samples have a beginning and an end, right? And that's we can have a conversation about that sometime. It's a lot. It's interesting. But what is the hallmark of that free sample and or permanent awakening, right? And that is the absolute sense, which induces a sense of freedom, as best I can describe it, right? That you are being lived. You are not living, right? But you are being lived. What causes you to be lived? Because that's the way we're describing it. The you isn't there. All that's there is the living itself, right? So, and he goes on to say that. He says, yes, I appear to hear and see and talk and act, but to me, it just happens. He says, as to you, digestion or perspiration happens. The body mind machine looks after it and leaves me out of it. Right? There's no me to be in it, so it gets left out. Just as you do not need to worry about growing hair, so I need not worry about words and actions. They just happen and leave me unconcerned. For in my world, nothing ever goes wrong. Right? So, and that's how he ends it. But in that ending, he gives this amazing little last piece, which is the sense of being lived. That's what's really important. Now, if you stop and actually start to watch your own behavior, you're going to start to find out that the behavior itself happens. In fact, they've scientifically been able to, I always hate to use, Ramesh used to love scientific stuff like this. I always kind of feel like if it's scientifically discovered, I'm not sure that that's all that persuasive, but nonetheless, they have been able to actually see that the thought occurs in the mind after the activity itself has taken place, right? So it's a lot like how when you look out there, your perception in your eyes is upside down, but there's an automatic piece in the brain that turns it right side up. So think about the claiming of an activity as your own, right? The activity happens, right? The ego takes it, turns it upside down, and claims it as your own. And now it makes sense, right? But absent that mind activity of setting it into a pattern of causality that you yourself autonomously created, right? Absent that, then the world happens. Now we have those experiences. You can watch in your own life when those things happen. And I think I've told, I always tell, I tell a story about a baseball player, one of my favorites when I was a kid, who steals second base, right? And he comes into the locker room, and the reporters are waiting for him, and they say, "Hey, you stole second base. How did that happen?" And he says, "Well, the wind was blowing out, and I noticed the second baseman was here." And he goes on in quite a detailed explanation. And they all are happy, and they write their down. Now they have a story to report, right? The reporters leave, and the fellow in the locker next to him says, "Hey, Willie," he said, "none of that stuff happened, did it?" He goes, "No, I just stole second base." He said, "But if I don't make up all of that stuff for them, they don't have a story to write." So think of your mind as the reporters sitting around waiting for you to concoct a story that really doesn't exist, right? You, in your behavior, that happened before the story had to be written. And notice that your mind is doing the writing. It does that. It has it written, published, and ready for consumption as quickly as the event itself happens. You're dealing in those biological nanoseconds, right? But if you start to notice your own behavior, it's a wonderful pointer to notice that you are in every way lived in every moment, right? That's happening. And when you wipe the top off, that's what's underneath. But as long as the mind obscures the whole thing, and what's arising cannot be seen in terms of it's arising, which is uncaused, unbeckoned, all of those things. It just is a happening, right? Then you're always going to be stuck with the reporters of the mind's version of what that event was, right? So that's the world that we live in. That's what gives rise to an ego, right? Because your body mind starts to basically, the minute it does something, it thinks, oh, there must be a thing. I'm going to call it I, right? And not only am I going to call it I'm going to make it the main piece of everything I do from now to the day, quote unquote, I die, right? And I'm going to be really sad when I die. I mean, I know I made it up, right? I know it's a fictional character and all, but I'm going to be really sad about that, right? Because the fear is that there's absolutely nothing besides that I that's been created. That's the fear. That's the fear of death. All fear resides. I would believe all fear resides about that, around that discovery that, oh, holy shit, I could be gone. I would be upset about that, right? Whenever that happens in one's life, that seems to be the fear. And the fear, of course, surrounds the body mind. The body mind has a beginning, has an end, right? So this ego that we create, the story we create in the body mind that it goes to, all of those are arisings in consciousness. They have beginnings and they have ends. All right, cool. Anything, any questions or comments at this point?
Nothing other than I thought you expressed that beautifully.
Thank you. One of the things about doing, I'll tell you what's kind of interesting is that you think, oh, I want to, I'm going to do a satsang. We'll go for an hour, and you get into a satsang, and a lot of times you're 12 minutes in and your world has been turned upside down and you don't remember the last 48 minutes anyway. So, and so today's, I think this is one to go back and read over and over, because it's a way of recalibrating how our conditioning holds itself. And that conditioning is going to come into play the minute it can sneak back in there. So this is a really great chapter to revisit and work with.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Yep.
So I guess I'll make a little bit of a statement first before asking a question. So like if I'm experiencing my own mind, I mean, I'm using that my
Sure.
word, but my my experience is it's like, okay, if I'm thinking, my awareness is associated with the thought. So it's like I'm lost in the thought, or I'm lost in the perception of a thing, and then I become identified with that perception or with that thought. So if I pull myself back, and then I can just see the thought or see the perception, then I feel like for me, at where I'm in my current understanding of it, that is like I amness, is being able to just perceive without attachment to the experience or to the thought. Once I was like walking, I was just like walking, and I think the question came to me, which comes first, the mental word or the mental picture? And that's kind of how I went, fell down this like rabbit hole. Um, and anyway, it feels to me like a lot of times what he's saying is he's almost always talking to the awareness that's trapped in the thought or trapped in the perception when he talks about your world. To me, that's what he's talking about.
Absolutely. Yep.
And he's saying that he's always not in that place. To me, that's like my current understanding of it. And so I guess my question is, am I correct in saying that it's not that there's a practice, but um I'm at a loss for words for not describing it as through a doership, but one is trying to just stay in that state. One is staying in that state to be awakened.
Correct. And so what happens is it was great. You kind of stayed away from the practice piece, which I, because what happens is that consciousness itself will actually handle the practice piece, right? So it takes it out of the hands of the ego. So that's that whole concept about that. And so, and in this case, it's that within the I am, within awareness or pure being or awareness itself, right? When it's not attached to the drama that's arising, the mind or the mind stuff that arises and falls, that it actually already occupies a place where the awareness can be as to what's arising within it. That's how I would say it as best as I can, right? And then the trick is always to also make sure that you include you within the arising, right? That this going into the I am, what happens is that some folks never, they leave themselves there. In other words, they say, oh, I can see the witnessing here. I am back here witnessing, right? Actually, it's a really cool meditation, but it's a Tibetan meditation. At least that's where I got it, was from the Tibetan monks. And what you do is you simply look out at what's out in front of you, right? And you identify all of that. You go ahead and pull that into your perception, whatever happens to be in the field of perception, right? Then you close your eyes, right? Holding that sense of the field of perception, right? And then you take a step back, as it were. And when I say that, your awareness moves back, and now that perception includes, the back of your head, or you are now within that perception, right? And that's kind of a physical way of doing exactly what you and I just, or what you'd actually described, but always make sure that this body, mind, and everything that is deemed to be you is in the arising. And that's kind of just a physical way of doing that and getting that sense, because the awareness itself is available and happening when not covered by all of the you and the stuff and all the rest of it, right? It's there. It's always there, right? So all that's happening is conscious. There's a recognition within consciousness, and then the movement occurs, right? So it's kind of funky in a way, right? Because we want to say, well, how does it occur, or how do I make it occur? Those are the kinds of things that we would naturally want to ask, right? And you've got to let that kind of linguistic or cause and effect or whatever, you got to let that out and recognize that that's not at play, right? And ultimately it never ends up being at play in the end, but that's the trek, is to get there. And so what trips us up is the moment of the revelation of seeing one of the pointers, right? And then attempting to litigate or negotiate that pointer from our already assumed ways of thinking and dealing with things, right? So we're always we get the pure pond, we poison it. We get the pure pond, we poison it. So the awareness is as to, right? It's as to seeing that our approaches are built into that other way of looking at ourselves. So almost anything that we do, all right, in terms of then, as I say, transacting or litigating, or whatever you want to call that experience with, playing with that, you start to go, oh, I've got the past in here, I got the future in here. Well, being is, we've talked about that before. There's no such thing as past or future, right? All it is within perception, right? Perception is what's moving along. You are always here and now. Now that's not a way we think, right? We don't think that way. We think that we're on the train moving along, and that that we came from the past and we're going to the future, and the present is this little piece that's happening right here and now. When in fact that's all there is, because if it's the past, right, we've held it in memory. It's no longer here. It's no longer happening. And if it's the future, we basically project it and flip it into the future. Right. We even get freaked out about that ahead of time. Like that's so, and all of that are simply interpretations, because, right, it's based entirely on a whole plethora of conditionings and education and capabilities that build a particular idea of anything. So we already know that any of those ideas within consciousness aren't anything you can hang your hat on. They just aren't. So attempting to, deal with this from that point, that's the part that you watch. Just watch for that, and you'll see it. Your mind will go, oh, look what I did. And that, like, I'm telling you, this whole journey, if you can hold it this way, is an entertainment ticket worth millions of dollars that you pay zero for. Because you are creating for yourself one of the most amazing movements that you'll start to see it and go, wow, right? Because it's right there. And actually, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun watching yourself lurch into a place of thought and then dissolving, lurching into a place of thought and then dissolving, right? It's that's the basic activity here.
Thoughts are funny things. I was asked one time if you went out to the mailbox and you got your mail and there was an envelope in there and all it had on it was your name, no return address, no address at all, just your name, and you open it up and it's directions on how you should live your life, would you follow those directions? And it's like, well, no. I mean, I don't know where that came from or who it came. They said, well, where do thoughts come from? And why do you follow them? It's
There you
just,
go. There you go. Okay, I think we've come to that was a great question. Thank you, Michael. Your piece was excellent. I thought it was really nice. As I said, this is not a chapter for the timid. So we had a great run.
Actually, I have another question, just real quick, and I think Ron has a
Okay.
question too.
Oh, does he? Does Ron have his hand up?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he did.
So like when Tanner was speaking, that actually gets back to my question at the very beginning about like the placement of the I am, because it's obvious that the way that Tanner was describing things, that he has access to the witness. He's stepped back and he's seeing the objects, thoughts, feelings, and emotions, the external world, if you will, showing up in front and presenting itself to that witness. And then he said, like, that's what is taken as the I am, right? Um, and he said that it was the thoughts, feelings, emotions, external world that are actually covering up the witness, and you have to kind of get behind all of those stories and thoughts to actually discover that there's some ever never changing sort of presence there that's looking at everything or experiencing everything. But like I said, it seems like most people that are showing up in the satsangs have access to the witness, right? And are attaching an I amness to that. And one of the things that keeps coming up for me is that I amness is still egoic. There's still attachment to that I amness, and it's actually obscuring, just like the stories are obscuring the witness. The witness is a contraction as well that's obscuring, quote unquote, what's behind it. And it's that what's behind it that we're trying to get to.
I agree.
And to call that the I am, like this is where, like, where to place the I
Oh, I
am
agree. I agree.
is it gets really, because to agree with the I amness being at the witness is to confuse if the I am is also at the absolute. It feels like there just needs to be some sort of differentiation between those two because they're not the same.
It's still an identity. You're taking identity with the witness then,
Mm.
Right.
and I remember asking my teacher about this witness. And she looked at me and she said, well, just wait until there's the witness behind that witness, and then the witness behind
Right.
that one, and then the witness behind that one,
Right.
and so on until there is
Well, see,
nothing.
that's the
There.
thing is, like, I don't, um, the witness is a contraction. And if there's a witness behind the witness, I think that's just a thought. There is no witness except for the witness. And if there's an imagining of another witness behind that, then that's illusion to me. Like, there is the witness, and what's behind the witness is
There is no
what I would
witness.
call the absolute or the unknown.
Right. So the way I look at it is that the you start witnessing from the I am, which I agree is still tainted by whatever the pieces are, but consciousness itself, consciousness or awareness magnetizes, as you will, back to where there isn't any longer any of that. And so that's where the terminology in my mind gets confused. Now, I think in a way to claim that some of it's illusion because you can't identify it or whatever, that's just the experience of it itself is that the pull actually happens, and the world of Nisargatta is what ultimately is occupied, so to speak. I would just simply say it that way. To get into creating a roadblock because it's tainted, so it always needs to be tainted until proved otherwise. I think that, in my mind, I think that one might want to let it happen first and then come back with the experience of the happening and say, I don't know how to describe it, but yes, at one point in time, it seems eminently describable, but in the end, it's eminently undescribable. And in between, right, I'm using a bunch of really, awkward and tough words to try to describe all those places. That's how I would go after that particular piece, which is the same conversation as we had before.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's because I think otherwise, in a certain way, you relegate yourself to a place you can never get out of. I don't know how you get out of this is where the I am is, and I'm going to take the I am to be in essence self-containing. That I think, well, I think a lot of folks that discuss it and write about it might take a spot like that, but the experience of it, right, if you want to call it that, or the movement itself yields what it yields, right? And again, I always say consciousness. it's funny because to me it's a magnetization. The absolute magnetizes everything, right? Within, pure being is a magnetization, if you will, that pulls everything back to it, which is the purpose of the entirety of what happens in the arising and the falling, right? In other words, it arises, and when there is no more universe, it's magnetized home, so to speak, if you want to use that. Again, I'm not asserting there's some pull and cause and effect in that. I'm just using that as a visual. So
Well, the only
you-
2 cents I had
what? Go for it.
was let me go in the other room because my dog doesn't want me to talk.
Ah,
1 sec. So, in my experience, working with you, Alan, is the witness and the I am and everything. At some point, we don't even need to talk about it. So when I've been confronted in doing the internal work, as you know, the last 5 years, I've spent most of my time alone. So the internal work got really rich. And at one point, when I was dissolving concepts and self-inquiry, I really thought I was in control of that. And then at one point, I realized I'm not in control of this process at all. It's just happening. It's happening internally. I'm aware of it happening internally. And it seems like the only thing that really needs to be done is just to be quiet and let it happen. Because I really don't think I have much to do with it at all. And I think that just lends itself to what you were talking about as far as being lived. I think I've settled into the place of being lived rather than trying to interpret everything about how living is happening. So I just wanted to add that for whatever it's worth, if you want to comment on that.
no, I mean, it's always interesting because, Nisargatta would say that awakening is pure relaxation. And if awakening hasn't happened, but pure relaxation has, who cares?
Yeah. And so my only barometer right now is it's not the intellectual interpretation, but it's what level of tension am I living with? So if I'm living with a level of tension, I know I have to sit with that and allow the dissolution to happen so that I'm not in tension anymore.
Yeah.
And going into interpretation about it would only cause me more tension. And I'd rather not go into that tension and just be quiet internally and let things move on their own.
Well, and I wrote a piece, actually, I think Mike's going to put it out there, called The Crossover, which to me it's just kind of a thing I give to people who go, hey, you're from the West. So crossing over into this place where it's not all organized, constructed, ready for consumption, right? That's a big challenge. And so what you're describing is the land of the crossover, right? Where as I said, the concepts themselves, they're pointers, right? So as Ramana used to say, pointers are like thorns. You use one thorn to take another thorn out. And then there's the part nobody ever mentions, which is, and when you're done, throw the thorns away. That's the crossover.
You're right.
So
And yeah, it just seems like there's no hurry to get wherever I'm supposed to go. I'll just let it happen on its own and be good with what's arising moment to moment. And it seems like that's the most simplistic thing to do. And then contemplating the concepts or parsing the concepts to try to arrive at a place that describes the simplicity of it all is complicated.
isn't that funny?
Yeah.
Describing simplicity is complicated. We should put that out on the board. Anyway.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Cool.
Okay. Thank you.